The doors were supposed to stay locked. Adrian had given the order himself. No one in, no one out. Not until he knew which of his men was still his men. So when the brass handles turned at 9,004 p.m., every gun in the room came up at once. What walked through wasn't an assassin. It was a woman who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else, holding a cake box and a child's hand, like both were the only things she had left to protect. Adrian didn't move. He'd spent 4 months learning that stillness was the only power he had left. The ballroom around him had cost more than most men made in a decade to fill. 50 round tables draped in white linen, 500 gold-rimmed chairs, towers of orchids flown in that morning from a greenhouse in Ecuador. A 3-tier cake sat untouched on its own marble pedestal, iced in gold script that read, "Happy birthday, boss." A joke someone on his staff must have thought was safe to make back when Adrian could still stand up and end a joke he didn't like. Now the joke sat there melting under the chandeliers, and nobody had come to eat it. He'd sent 200 invitations. Capos who owed him their houses, politicians who owed him their careers, judges who owed him more than they'd ever admit under oath. Every one of them had a reason to be here, and every one of them had chosen, instead, to be somewhere else. Adrian gripped the cold metal rims of his wheelchair and watched condensation slide down an abandoned champagne flute 2 tables away. It was, he realized, the only motion in the room. The string quartet had packed up an hour ago. The waiters had been dismissed, hurrying out with their eyes on the floor, the way people look away from something that's already dead. Below his waist, nothing. A void where a kingdom used to stand on 2 legs. 4 months since the bullets meant for his heart had found his spine instead, outside a restaurant that used to be his favorite. 4 months of surgeries and physical therapy that felt like punishment for a crime he hadn't confessed to. He'd told himself, lying in that hospital bed, that surviving was the victory. Tonight, he understood the truth. His men had already voted on without saying a word. A paralyzed boss was a dead boss. They just hadn't buried him yet. Boss. Marco's voice came low from near the coat check, one of only 2 men who'd stayed. His hand hovered at his jacket. "We should go. If Luciano's making a move, let him," Adrian said. His voice came out rougher than he meant it to, unused for the better part of an hour. "Let him walk in here and look me in the eye while he does it." He wasn't afraid of a bullet. He'd already survived one. What he couldn't survive again was being disrespected in a room he'd built with his own hands, by men who no longer had the decency to do it to his face. That was when the double doors groaned open. Marco's gun came up, the slide racked, sharp and final against the marble silence. Adrian turned his chair to face the entrance, slow, deliberate, refusing to let anyone see him flinch. If this was the hit, he'd take it looking forward. It wasn't Luciano. A woman stood in the doorway, blinking against the chandelier light like she'd walked in from a different planet. Her coat had clearly seen better winters. In one arm, she balanced a bakery box that sagged slightly at one corner, and in her other hand she held on to a small boy whose clip-on bow tie was crooked. Like he'd fought his mother on wearing it and lost, she took in the ballroom, the empty gold chairs, the wilting orchids, the untouched cake, the man alone in a wheelchair at the center of it all, and her expression wasn't fear, it was confusion. "I think I have the wrong party," she said. "Or the right address and the wrong century." Marco didn't lower the gun. "Who are you? This building is locked down." She looked at the pistol pointed at her chest with the mild irritation of a woman who'd already had a long day and did not intend to let a firearm make it longer. "I'm Emma. This is Noah. We have a cake for a Mr. Moretti. And I've had a $50 delivery fee riding on this since 6 o'clock, so if somebody could put that away." "Put it down," Adrian said quietly. Marco hesitated, then obeyed. Emma crossed the ballroom like the guns and the chandeliers, and the 500 empty chairs were simply inconveniences between her and getting paid. Her son trailing behind her with wide eyes fixed on the ceiling. She set the box down beside a silver platter of lobster no one had touched and pulled a crumpled slip of paper from her coat pocket. $45 for the cake. Card reader's broken, so it's cash. Adrian stared at her, this stranger who had walked past 2 sets of empty security gates and a drawn weapon to collect $45, and felt something crack loose in his chest that had been sealed shut since the hospital. A low, disbelieving laugh rose out of him before he could stop it. You... To understand why that sound mattered, why an empty ballroom could feel like a death sentence to a man who once owned half the judges in the city, you have to go back to who Adrian Moretti was before the bullet, and why an empire built on fear was never built to survive the day its king could no longer stand. Adrian just laughed for the first time in 4 months because of a stranger who owed him nothing. If you were Emma, would you have walked away the second you realized who he was, or stayed? Drop your answer below. I read every single comment, and it genuinely shapes where the story goes next. Chapter 2 gets darker fast. Don't miss it. Turn on notifications so you're first in line. Emma counted the cash Adrian's guard handed her. 60 for the cake, an extra 10 for the trouble, and was halfway to tucking it into her coat when Noah tugged her sleeve. He's not going to eat by himself, is he? Noah was staring past her at the man in the wheelchair, and the untouched 3-tier cake glowing gold under the chandeliers. It's his birthday. Noah, we should go. Nobody sang to him. Adrian, close enough to hear every word, watched the boy with something unreadable in his face. He was used to men twice, Noah's age flinching when he so much as looked at them. This one just looked concerned, the way a kid looks at a stray dog left out in the rain. It's fine, Adrian said, his voice softer than he meant it to be. Not much of a party to sing at. That's dumb. You still get a song. That's the rule. Marco tensed near the coat check, unsure whether to laugh or apologize on the kid's behalf. Emma opened her mouth to pull her son back, but Adrian, to his own surprise, held up a hand. Let him say it. Noah marched right up to the wheelchair without hesitation, studying Adrian's legs with open curiosity. Did someone hurt them, or did you just forget to try standing again? The question landed like a dropped glass. Emma froze. Marco's hand twitched toward his jacket out of instinct. Adrian felt the old anger flare, then it broke apart into something else. A laugh, rough and real, came out of him before he could stop it. Someone hurt them, Adrian said. I haven't figured out how to forget yet. Noah nodded, like that was a perfectly reasonable answer, and climbed onto the chair beside him, already reaching for the candles. Emma exhaled, some of the tension leaving her shoulders, though she kept glancing at the abandoned tables, the 2 still guards, the math of the evening that didn't add up. You really didn't have anyone come? She asked. All this, and nobody? Apparently not. She didn't ask why. He appreciated that more than she'd ever know. Noah lit the candles one by one with a lighter Marco reluctantly handed over, then insisted on singing, badly, loudly, off-key, with Emma joining in halfway through out of what looked like sheer social obligation. For the length of one song, the ballroom didn't feel like a funeral for an empire. It felt, briefly, like a birthday. Adrian blew out the candles. He didn't make a wish. I should find your kitchen, Emma said afterward, brushing icing off her palms. Wash the tin the cake came in. Have it. It's not mine to keep. Through the far doors, past the hall, Marco offered. She slipped away, Noah occupied with the last of the cake, and Adrian let his guard down enough to almost enjoy the quiet. It didn't last. Emma found the kitchen easily, but the door beside it cracked open, low voices leaking through, pulled her attention before she reached the sink. She recognized one voice as belonging to a man who'd been standing near the ballroom entrance earlier, arms crossed, saying nothing. By midnight, before he changes the security detail, DeMarco wants it clean, no mess in the ballroom, not with the kid running around. A second voice harder, kid's not our problem. Moretti's out of time either way. Man can't even hold a gun steady anymore. Emma's hand went still on the tin. A third voice, closer to the door, go get positioned. He's alone with the boy's mother and 2 guards. Won't be an easier window than this. The tin slipped and clattered into the sink. The voices went silent. Emma didn't wait to find out what came next. She grabbed Noah's hand the second she reached the ballroom, cutting off whatever Adrian was about to say. We need to leave. Right now. Somebody in that kitchen just said, tonight's your last night. Marco's hand was already on his weapon. Somewhere near the service entrance, a door that should have been locked clicked open. The first shot came from the balcony above the west wall, a service walkway nobody used except for lighting rigs and dead flowers. Marco shoved Emma and Noah behind an overturned table before the second shot cracked, splintering the marble a foot from Adrian's wheelchair. Move him, Marco shouted to the second guard. who was already dragging Adrian's chair sideways behind the head table, using the thick wood as cover. Adrian's hands found the wheels and pushed, adding his own momentum, refusing to be dead weight in his own assassination. A third shot buried itself in the cake stand, sending white frosting and gold script across the marble floor. Emma pressed Noah's face into her shoulder, her heart slamming, furious at herself for still being in this building. Through the gap under the table, she watched Marco return fire toward the balcony, watched a shadow up there stumble back out of sight. Then, as fast as it started, it stopped. Footsteps retreated. A door slammed somewhere far off in the service corridor. Silence dropped back over the ballroom, heavier now than before. No longer the silence of abandonment, but the silence of something that had just barely failed. Adrian sat with his back against the overturned table, breathing hard, staring at the woman who'd walked in for a cake delivery, and walked out having saved his life twice in one night, without meaning to either time. "You should have run when you had the chance," he said. Emma, still shaking, still holding her son, looked back at him with something sharper than fear. "So should you." Emma just built an invisible army out of nurses, janitors, and cab drivers. People powerful men never bother to notice. Here's my question for you. Who's the most invisible person in your own life that actually notices everything? Tell me in the comments. I want to hear real stories. We're halfway to the confrontation now. Chapter 5 is where it gets personal. Follow so you don't lose the thread. Nobody moved for a long moment after the silence settled. Marco kept his gun trained on the balcony, waiting to see if it had been a warning shot or a botched job. When nothing else came, he lowered the weapon and looked back at Adrian with the expression of a man recalculating everything he thought he knew about tonight. "Boss, we need to get you out of the ballroom." "Not yet." Adrian's eyes were still on Emma, who hadn't let go of Noah, whose knuckles had gone white around her son's shoulder. She heard something before the shots. Emma's jaw tightened. Every instinct in her told her to grab her son and disappear into the city. Forget she'd ever seen this ballroom, this man, any of it. But Noah was trembling against her, and she was still angry, angrier than she had any right to be about a stranger's problem. "2 men, maybe 3, she said, in a room off the kitchen. One of them said someone named DeMarco wanted it done clean. Said it wouldn't be an easier window than tonight. That you were alone except for me and my son and 2 guards. Marco's face went rigid. Adrian said nothing for a moment, absorbing the name like a blow he'd been half expecting and hoping never to receive. Luciano DeMarco, his underboss, the man who'd sat 2 seats to his right at every meeting for 6 years, who'd visited him in the hospital with flowers and false comfort, who'd sworn to his face that the family was solid, that Adrian only needed to heal. "You're certain of the name," Adrian said quietly. "I'm certain of what I heard through a door I wasn't supposed to be listening at," Emma said. "I don't know who anybody is here. I didn't ask to know. But you told me anyway, because your guard was about to get shot in the back, and so was my son," Emma snapped. "Not because I wanted a part in whatever this is." Adrian studied her, the exhaustion under her eyes, the protective grip on Noah, the fact that she still hadn't run despite every reason to. Most people who worked for him for a decade had learned to lie smoothly. This woman, who owed him nothing, hadn't bothered to soften a single word. "Marco," Adrian said, "get them a car. Have Sal drive them himself, not the valet staff, not to tonight. Boss, if DeMarco's people are watching the exits, then Sal takes the service route." Adrian's voice hardened into something closer to the man he used to be before the wheelchair, before the ballroom emptied out around him. "Nobody touches them. Am I understood?" Marco nodded once and moved to make the call. Emma exhaled, some of the fight draining out of her now that the immediate danger had passed. "Thank you," she said, surprised at how much she meant it. "I just want to go home." "I know." Adrian wheeled himself closer, stopping a respectful distance away. "But I need to ask you something first. And you can say no." Noah looked between the 2 adults with the open curiosity of a child who understood something serious was happening, but not what. "I don't want money," Emma said before he could finish. "If that's where this is going." "It's not." Adrian's jaw worked, like the words cost him something to say out loud. 6 years. Luciano DeMarco sat beside me at every table my family ever built. He watched every deal, every threat, every enemy I made. Men like that, know how to hide in plain sight, how to be invisible to people who are looking for danger. I don't understand what that has to do with me. You walked past 2 sets of security through a locked kitchen door, close enough to hear men planning a murder, and not one of them thought twice about a woman in an apron with a cake box. You were invisible to them. That's not luck. That's a kind of protection none of my soldiers have. Emma's stomach turned cold at the implication forming in the space between them. You want me to spy for you? I want to survive the next attempt, Adrian said. And I don't have anyone left I can trust not to already be working for him. I have a son, a job, a life that has nothing to do with any of this. I know. Adrian's voice dropped, quieter now, almost apologetic. I'm not asking you to want this. I'm telling you that after tonight, DeMarco's men may already have seen your face in that ballroom. Whether you help me or walk away, you're already closer to this than you wanted to be. The truth of it settled over Emma like a weight she hadn't asked to carry. She looked down at Noah, who was watching her with the trust of a child who believed his mother could fix anything, and felt something shift inside her. Not courage exactly, but the refusal to be made a victim of a war she hadn't started. If I do this, she said slowly, my son doesn't come anywhere near it. Ever. He goes to school, he comes home, and none of this touches him. You have my word. Your word, Emma repeated, something dry and humorless in her voice, from a man whose own men just tried to have him killed. Adrian almost smiled. Fair. She looked toward the ballroom doors, toward the city waiting beyond them, indifferent to everything that had almost happened tonight. Then she looked back at the man in the wheelchair, feared by everyone, who'd abandoned him, and somehow, impossibly, still standing in the only way that mattered. Fine, Emma said, but the second this puts Noah in danger, I'm gone. No warning, no warning. Understood. For the first time since the bullet had taken his legs, Adrian Moretti felt something other than rage settle into the empty space where his empire used to be. It felt, cautiously, like the beginning of a plan. Chapter 4. Invisible people. 3 weeks passed before Emma understood what she'd actually agreed to. It didn't look like the movies. Nobody handed her a gun or a fake identity. Instead, Adrian gave her an untraceable phone, a modest bank account for consulting, and a single instruction: find the people nobody bothers to notice. She started with Denise, the night nurse at St. Tor, Basil's, who'd once stitched up Emma's hand after a bakery accident, and still asked about Noah every Christmas. Denise worked the floor where DeMarco's cousin had been recovering from a minor surgery, and nurses, Emma had learned, heard everything a patient said while sedated and thought no one was listening. You want me to just pay attention? Denise had asked, skeptical, over coffee in the hospital cafeteria. You already do, Emma said. I'm just asking you to tell me what you hear. It was that simple, and that was the part that unsettled Emma most. Nobody she approached needed convincing that the world ignored them. Delivery drivers, who spent entire days in the elevators and hallways of buildings owned by DeMarco's shell companies. Janitors who mopped the floors of cigar lounges after the men who ran the city had gone home, leaving behind receipts, phone numbers scrawled on napkins, half-finished conversations. Taxi drivers who ferried DeMarco's lieutenants from meeting to meeting and had long since learned to make themselves furniture in the front seat. None of them had ever been asked what they knew. Emma simply asked. Within 2 weeks, she had 11 names feeding her small, disconnected pieces of information. Nothing any one of them would call dangerous, nothing that would get them killed if it slipped out over a family dinner. A driver mentioned a warehouse near the docks that got unusual traffic after midnight. A janitor mentioned a ledger left open in a locked office, numbers that didn't match the restaurant's usual receipts. A delivery boy mentioned a name, Vittorio, repeated too many times in a phone call he wasn't supposed to overhear. Emma brought each piece to Adrian in a small notebook, refusing his offer of anything more formal. The second this becomes official, she told him, sitting across from his desk in the study of the Moretti estate, it becomes something that can be traced back to real people. I'm not doing that to them. You're building something dangerous, Adrian said, not as a warning but as an observation, studying the notebook like it was worth more than anything in his vault. I'm building something invisible, Emma corrected. There's a difference. He didn't argue. Across the city, Luciano DeMarco was beginning to feel that difference without understanding its shape. A shipment meant to move quietly through the docks got flagged by customs 2 days early. Enough warning for Adrian's remaining loyal captains to intercept it and seize the profits for themselves. A meeting DeMarco had scheduled in strict confidence with 2 wavering capos got interrupted by Adrian's own men, who arrived with an offer neither capo could refuse. 20 minutes before DeMarco's car even pulled up. "Someone's talking," DeMarco snapped at his lieutenant, Vitaria, in the back office of the restaurant he used as a front. "Every move I make, Moretti's one step ahead of it. We've swept for bugs. Twice. Then it's not a bug." DeMarco's hand tightened around his glass. "It's a person. Find them." But there was no one person to find. That was the problem Emma had built without fully realizing its brilliance. There was no single leak, no informant DeMarco could threaten or bribe into silence, because the information didn't live in any one place. It lived in 100 small, disconnected moments. A nurse's overheard sedation-slurred confession, a janitor's 5 minutes alone in an office, a cab driver's memory of an address repeated twice. DeMarco's men tore through his organization looking for a traitor among the capos, the guards, the accountants, anyone who might have Adrian's ear. They found nothing, because they were looking in exactly the wrong place. It never occurred to any of them to suspect the delivery boy who'd brought lunch to the office 3 times a week, or the woman who emptied the trash bins after everyone else had gone home. Adrian, watching from his study as the pieces started falling into place, felt something he hadn't felt in months. The quiet, dangerous pleasure of being underestimated by someone who thought he already understood the shape of his opponent. "He thinks I'm still fighting the way I used to," Adrian said one evening as Emma laid out the week's information across his desk. "Guards, guns, intimidation. He doesn't know he's fighting something he can't even see. He'll figure it out eventually," Emma said. "Somebody will slip. Somebody always does. Then we move faster than that." Adrian looked at her, and there was something almost like respect in it now, replacing the wary calculation from their first conversation. "You've done in 3 weeks what my entire security detail couldn't do in 4 months. Emma didn't smile at the compliment. Not entirely. She was thinking of Noah, home with a babysitter, unaware his mother was quietly assembling a small army of ordinary people willing to risk their livelihoods on behalf of a man they'd never met. "I need you to understand something," she said. "These aren't soldiers. Denise has 3 kids. Marcus drives that cab 12 hours a day to pay off his mother's medical bills. If any of them get hurt because of this." "They won't," Adrian said. "You don't know that." "No," Adrian admitted. "But I know what happens if we don't try. DeMarco doesn't stop with me. He'll need to secure every loose thread once he takes over. And you and your son became a thread the moment you walked into that ballroom." Emma said nothing, because there was nothing to say to that. The war she hadn't wanted any part of had already made its choice for her. Outside, across the city, DeMarco slammed his office door hard enough to rattle the glass, no closer to understanding who was quietly dismantling everything he'd spent years building. Only that, whoever it was, they were somewhere he couldn't see. The mistake, when it finally came, was small enough that Emma almost missed making it herself. She'd stopped by Denise's apartment after a shift, notebook in her bag as always, and hadn't noticed the car idling across the street until she was already back on the sidewalk. It wasn't the car itself that gave her pause. It was the man in the passenger seat, the same man she'd seen twice now outside the restaurant DeMarco used as a front, dressed like he belonged nowhere near this neighborhood. She told herself it was nothing. She told Adrian anyway. By the time DeMarco's men had finished pulling the thread, it hadn't taken them long. A janitor question, too, pointed. A nurse's schedule cross-referenced against a cab driver's log. Somewhere in that quiet web of ordinary people, one connection led back to a woman who baked cakes for a living and had, 4 weeks ago, walked into Adrian Moretti's ballroom by mistake. Vittoria brought the name to DeMarco with the smug satisfaction of a man who'd solved a puzzle no one else could. Emma Collins. Single mother. No connections to the family. No reason to be involved, except she's the one who warned him the night of the party. She's been running errands for half the city ever since. Nurses, drivers, janitors, all of it comes back to her. DeMarco was quiet for a long moment, turning the information over. She's the leak. She's the whole network. Then take care of it. The call came into Adrian's study at 11:40 that night. Not from Emma, but from Marcus, the cab driver, breathless and panicked, saying 2 men had been parked outside Emma's apartment building for 20 minutes and weren't moving. Adrian didn't hesitate. "Get her out, now. I don't care how." But he was already too late to simply give the order and wait. Something in him, something that had been dormant since the bullet took his legs, since he'd learned to let other men do his moving for him, refused to sit in his study while she paid for a war he'd pulled her into. "Take me," he told Marco. "Now, boss, you can't." That wasn't a request. By the time Adrian's car reached Emma's building, the 2 men from the street were already inside. Emma had heard the knock at her door go wrong before it fully registered. The wrong knock, too heavy, too patient. And had Noah's hand in hers, and the fire escape window opened before the door gave way behind her. She got 3 floors down before one of the men caught the fire escape above her close enough that she could hear his boots on the metal grating, close enough that she pushed Noah ahead of her into the alley and turned to face whatever came next because there was no more time to run. Adrian's car screeched into the alley half a second before the man reached the bottom rung. What happened next didn't look like the calculated, patient man Emma had come to know over the past month. Adrian had Marco stop the car, had the door open, had his weapon in hand before the wheels had fully stopped turning. A man who couldn't stand on his own 2 legs, refusing to be a passenger in the one moment that mattered most. The gunfire lasted less than 30 seconds. When it was over, one of DeMarco's men was down, the other fled into the dark, and Emma was on her knees in the alley with Noah crushed against her chest, both of them shaking, both of them alive. Adrian wheeled himself closer, his hands still trembling slightly from the adrenaline, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. Then Emma looked up at him, and what was in her eyes wasn't gratitude. It was fury. "I told you," she said, her voice shaking with something more dangerous than fear. "I told you the second this touched my son, I was done. He is 7 years old, Adrian. He just watched a man try to break into our home. I know. You built an empire on people being afraid of you. And now that empire almost got my son killed because you couldn't hold on to it yourself." She was on her feet now, Noah still gripped tight against her side, years of restraint breaking loose all at once. "You people, all of you, you don't care who gets hurt as long as you win. That's the whole rot of it. Fear doesn't build loyalty, Adrian. It just builds enemies who wait for the right moment." Adrian said nothing for a long time, staring at the ground, at the man he'd left bleeding in the alley behind him, at the woman shaking with rage in front of him for reasons that had nothing to do with the money he'd offered, and everything to do with the truth he hadn't wanted to hear. "You're right," he said finally. Emma blinked, thrown by how quickly the fight went out of him. "Everything I built ran on fear," Adrian continued, "and the moment I couldn't enforce that fear myself, it turned on me exactly the way you'd expect a house built on a bad foundation to collapse. I almost got you killed because I thought the only currency worth anything was loyalty bought through intimidation." He looks up at her, and there was something raw in his face that hadn't been there in the ballroom, hadn't been there even 3 weeks ago. "I'm not going to let that happen to you or your son again, whatever it costs me." Emma studied him, searching for the calculation she'd learned to expect from him, and didn't find it. "That's not a promise I can just believe," she said quietly. "Not after tonight." "I know," Adrian said. "So I won't ask you to believe it. I'll just prove it." Somewhere behind them, sirens began to echo through the streets, and above them the city carried on indifferent to the alley, where a feared man had just, for the first time in his life, chosen someone else's safety over his own. The press conference was Adrian's idea, though Emma was the one who insisted it needed to feel real enough to fool the one man who knew him best. "DeMarco spent 6 years reading you," she said, the morning they planned it out over coffee in Adrian's study. Noah's homework spread across the far end of the desk since the babysitter had cancelled. "If you surrender too easily, he'll smell the trap before it closes." "Then I don't surrender easily," Adrian said. "I surrender like a man who's finally run out of reasons to keep fighting." It took 2 days to get the performance right. Adrian met with a lawyer in public at a restaurant. DeMarco's people were known to watch, and made sure his voice carried just far enough for the wrong ears to hear him discuss transitioning family assets and stepping back from operational control. He let himself be photographed, looking older than he was, thinner, worn down by 4 months of a fight he was supposedly losing. He cancelled 2 scheduled meetings with loyal capos, letting the cancellations leak exactly the way real defeat would leak, through assistants who talked too much, through drivers who repeated things they'd overheard. By the end of the week, word had reached DeMarco through no fewer than 4 separate channels. Adrian Moretti was done. He's folding, Vittoria reported, unable to keep the satisfaction out of his voice. Announced it to his lawyer, wants to hand over operations quietly. Avoid a war nobody can win from a wheelchair. DeMarco allowed himself, for the first time in months, something close to relief. He'd spent weeks bleeding resources, chasing a leak he couldn't find, watching shipments and meetings fall apart, for reasons he still didn't understand. Half convinced Adrian had some invisible advantage he couldn't identify. This, an old rival simply giving up, was a far cleaner ending than the one he'd been bracing for. Set up the meeting, DeMarco said. Someplace symbolic. I want every capo who's still on the fence to see him hand it over in person. No ambiguity. No room for anyone to say later that I took it by force. The Olcott Hotel, a decaying luxury property DeMarco had quietly acquired years ago and used for business no one wanted traced to a legitimate address, was chosen for the surrender. Ironic, Adrian thought when he heard the location. The same kind of ballroom, the same crystal chandeliers gone slightly dim with neglect, dressed up one more time for what DeMarco believed would be his coronation. While DeMarco spent the week celebrating prematurely, Emma's network moved in the opposite direction, quiet and unremarkable as ever. A janitor who'd worked the Alcott for 11 years mapped every exit, every service corridor, every camera blind spot, and handed the information to Emma folded inside a grocery list. A delivery driver made 3 trips to the hotel that week under the pretense of catering deliveries, memorizing guard rotations each time. A cab company dispatcher, Marcus's cousin, recruited without ever being told why it mattered, kept a running log of every DeMarco associate who booked a car to or from the Alcott in the days leading up to the meeting. Adrian's remaining loyal capos, the ones who'd stayed through the humiliation of the empty ballroom and the chaos after, were briefed in pieces, never all together, never through the same channel twice. Emma had learned that lesson well by now. The fewer people who saw the whole shape of a plan, the fewer chances DeMarco had of hearing it whispered back to him. You understand what happens if this goes wrong? Emma said the night before, standing in Adrian's study while he reviewed the hotel's floor plan one final time. There's no false surrender if the trap fails. It's just a surrender. I know. And if DeMarco figures out it's a setup before you're inside that ballroom, then he kills me the same way he planned to at my birthday, Adrian said without flinching from the thought the way he might have a month ago. The only difference is this time, I chose the room. Emma didn't have a response to that. She'd stopped expecting him to back away from risk weeks ago. Somewhere between the alley and this study, watching a man who used to rule through fear slowly rebuild himself into something that looked, unsettlingly, like courage. Noah asked about you today, she said instead, quieter. Wanted to know if the man in the wheelchair was going to be okay. Something shifted in Adrian's expression. The same crack she'd seen the night of the birthday party, when a child's blunt honesty had cut through 4 months of grief faster than any doctor or capo ever had. Tell him I'm going to be fine, Adrian said. Are you sure that's true? No, Adrian admitted, but it's what you tell a kid who cared enough to ask. The morning of the meeting arrived overcast and still, the kind of grey that made the Olcott's faded gold trim look older than it was. DeMarco arrived first, flanked by a dozen men he trusted, and a handful more he was still deciding whether to trust, positioning himself at the center of the ballroom like a king already crowned. He didn't notice the extra staff moving quietly through the service halls, dressed exactly like hotel employees, because they were every one of them recruited weeks ago by a woman he'd never once considered a threat. He didn't notice the black cars parked 2 streets over, engines idling, waiting for a signal that hadn't come yet. He only noticed when the ballroom doors finally opened, and Adrian Moretti wheeled calmly into the center of the room alone, that something about the silence felt different from the silence of victory he'd been expecting all week. Adrian, DeMarco said, spreading his arms with practiced warmth. I'm glad you finally see reason. I do, Adrian said, and there was something in his voice, steady, unhurried, entirely too calm for a man supposedly surrendering everything he'd built, that made DeMarco's smile falter for just a fraction of a second. I finally see exactly how this ends. DeMarco's smile hadn't finished falling before the doors at the back of the ballroom opened. Not the grand double doors he'd walked through himself, expecting an audience for his coronation. The service doors, the ones his men had stopped watching hours ago because nobody thought to guard an entrance meant for waiters and dishwashers. Hotel staff who weren't hotel staff at all moved through them in 2s and 3s, and by the time DeMarco's men understood what was happening, every exit in the Alcott ballroom had already been quietly sealed. "What is this?" DeMarco said, the warmth gone from his voice now, replaced by something tightening at the edges. "This," Adrian said, wheeling himself another few feet into the room, unhurried, "is you finding out what happens to men who think invisible people don't matter." The Choria's hand moved toward his jacket. It didn't get far. 2 of Adrian's men DeMarco had assumed were still loyal to him, men who'd spent the last 3 weeks quietly feeding Emma's network from the inside, had his arms pinned before the motion finished. DeMarco looked around the room, finally seeing what he should have seen the moment he walked in. The catering staff who weren't serving anything, the maintenance workers who weren't fixing anything, the black cars pulling up outside the windows that hadn't been there 10 minutes ago. Every loose end he thought he'd secured had been someone Emma had reached first. A nurse, a driver, a janitor, a delivery boy. Ordinary people he'd walked past 100 times without once considering them a threat. "You didn't win this with soldiers," DeMarco said, understanding arriving too late to help him. "You won it with the people you never bothered to see," Adrian finished. "The same mistake you made the night you sent men to kill me and called it clean." DeMarco's men were disarmed within minutes, the confrontation ending with none of the bloodshed he'd planned for Adrian's birthday months earlier. Adrian didn't raise his voice, didn't gloat the way the old version of him might have. He simply watched as the empire DeMarco had tried to steal folded quietly back into the hands of the man who'd rebuilt it from an empty ballroom and a stranger's kindness. "You'll answer for the birthday," Adrian said, as his men led DeMarco toward the doors. "And for the alley, not with a bullet. You don't get to make me into the man you assumed I'd become. You'll answer to the families whose loyalty you tried to buy with lies about a boss who couldn't stand on his own 2 legs. DeMarco didn't respond. There wasn't anything left to say to a man he'd underestimated twice and would never get the chance to underestimate again. By evening, word had already spread through what remained of the Moretti organization, not through fear this time, but through something closer to respect. Capos who'd stayed away from Adrian's birthday months ago sent word that they were ready to return, ready to fall back in line under a boss who'd proven in the space of a few months that a man didn't need his legs to outthink everyone who'd counted him out. Adrian let them come back. He didn't need to punish all of them the way DeMarco would have. He'd learned that lesson the hard way, in an empty ballroom from a woman who'd never asked to teach it to him. 3 weeks later, there was no ballroom, no chandeliers, no 500 empty chairs, no string quartet packing up early out of fear, just a small kitchen table in Emma's apartment chairs pulled close together, the smell of a cake baking that Noah had insisted on decorating himself. Gold icing spelled out in handwriting far less polished than the bakery version, but meaning infinitely more. "You're gonna mess up the letters?" Emma said, laughing, watching her son carefully squeeze icing from a bag that was clearly too big for his hands. "It's supposed to look homemade," Noah said, with the confidence of a boy who'd learned over the last several months that homemade things had a way of mattering more than the expensive kind. Adrian sat at the table, not at the head of it, not elevated above anyone the way he'd once insisted on being seated at every gathering that mattered, just a chair among chairs, close enough that Noah kept leaning against his arm without thinking twice about it, the way you lean against someone you've decided, without being told that you trust. "Happy birthday, boss." Noah read off the cake, squinting at his own crooked handwriting. "I know it's not your actual birthday anymore, but Mom said sometimes people need a second one." "She's right," Adrian said, and meant it more than he'd meant anything in years. Emma set 3 plates down, sliced the cake unevenly because Noah had insisted on cutting the first piece himself, and for a moment the 3 of them sat in a silence that had nothing in common with the silence of that first empty ballroom. No orchids wilting under abandoned chandeliers, no phantom ache in legs that no longer worked, No 500 chairs standing in for 500 betrayals. Just a small table, a homemade cake. Two people who'd walked in on the worst night of his life, carrying nothing but a bakery box, and stayed long after they had every reason to leave. Adrian thought of the empty ballroom often in the months that followed, not with the grief it used to carry, but with something closer to gratitude. Fear had built his empire once. It had also emptied every chair in that room the night he needed people most. Kindness had filled the only seats that ever mattered. "Make a wish," Emma said, sliding a single candle into a slice, laughing at the absurdity of a grown man's birthday cake with exactly one candle stuck crookedly in the icing. Adrian looked at her, then at Noah, who was already reaching for a second piece before anyone had finished the first. For the first time in his life, he didn't need to wish for anything. He already had it. 1 year ago, Adrian sat alone in a $50,000 ballroom. Tonight, he sat at a kitchen table over a homemade cake, and it was the best birthday of his life. If you could trade one expensive thing in your life for one real moment like that, would you? Comment your honest answer below. I want to know. If this story moved you even a little, share it with someone who needs the reminder. Real loyalty is rare, and it's worth celebrating.